The truck came every Tuesday before the rest of Holt County had finished its first coffee. It turned off Route 9 without slowing the engine, dropping a gear as the wheels found the gravel path that ran behind Clara Weston's property. She could hear it from inside the house, that particular groan of a loaded flatbed navigating a road that hadn't been graded since her great-uncle was alive. By the time she reached the back porch with her mug, the driver had already engaged the hydraulic lift. The bed tilted, the cargo shifted, then the maple came down. Enormous slabs, some stretching 8 feet long bark, still clinging to their curved edges, like something the tree hadn't finished deciding about. They hit the frozen Iowa ground with a sound that carried across the dormant field and bounced off the leaning barn 40 yards back. The driver didn't get out. He leveled the bed, gave the empty platform one cursory look, then reversed up the gravel path the way he'd come. The whole operation took less than 4 minutes. Clara stood on the porch in the kind of cold that made the inside of your nose feel like tin. She held the mug with both hands. She looked at the maple. She did not look confused. She did not look upset. She looked at those slabs the way a person looks at a letter they've been waiting for, without knowing they were waiting, something between recognition and surprise, like the mind arriving at a conclusion slightly before it can explain itself. The neighbors noticed. In Calder Mills, Iowa population around 900, noticing was both hobby and civic duty. Within a week of the first delivery, George Albright had repositioned the folding chair on his porch to face east instead of south. George was 67, retired from county surveying, and possessed of the particular patience that came from 30 years of watching land and drawing conclusions about it. He watched the slabs accumulate the way he'd once watched floodplains, with professional interest dressed up as casual observation. What nobody in Calder Mills could figure out was the logic of it. Why would a working sawmill deliver its excess to a woman's unused back acreage? What arrangement produced this, and why did the woman receiving 8 months of these deliveries seem more settled? With each one, not confused, not overwhelmed, but quietly, deliberately more at home in a place she'd only recently inherited. The answer would eventually reshape everything about Clara's life. It would take years to arrive at fully involve a substantial amount of ruined furniture, a public failure she'd carry for months, and one conversation she'd been holding inside her since she was 11 years old. But the first piece of it, the piece that made everything else possible, was simply that she had learned to look at something the world had already decided wasn't worth looking at. Clara Weston had grown up in Medford, Vermont, in a house where her mother kept the thermostat at 62 and called it character building. Her father sold insurance and coached youth baseball, and was the kind of man who fixed things on weekends, not because he had to, but because idle hands made him nervous. Medford was the kind of town where every grandfather had a workshop. Every workshop had a smell of linseed oil and sawdust, and nothing with genuine use left in it ever got thrown away. She'd left for Burlington at 18, then Boston at 23, following a marketing job at a firm that handled brand development for consumer goods companies. She was good at it, better than she expected to be, which made staying easier than leaving. A decade passed in the way that decades pass when the work is demanding enough to feel like a life client. Pitches, campaign cycles, quarterly reviews, the particular exhaustion of caring about things on behalf of people who cared about money. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the South End with walls she'd never bothered to paint because she never quite believed she was staying. The irony that she spent 10 years building marketing strategies for furniture companies, photographing grain textures, writing copy about craftsmanship, selling the idea of handmade quality to people who'd never set foot in a workshop, would not become clear to her until much later. At the time, it was just work. Effective, well-compensated, and hollowed out at the center in a way she couldn't have named if asked. Her great-uncle Harlan passed in December of her 38th year. He was her mother's uncle, a man she'd met perhaps a dozen times at family gatherings, who'd spent his entire adult life on 12 acres outside Calder Mills, growing soybeans badly and keeping to himself admirably. He left no spouse, no children, and an estate that consisted primarily of a farmhouse with original 1940s plumbing, a barn that leaned southeast at an angle that suggested either intention or imminent collapse, and the 12 acres themselves rocky soil, a view of the tree line that was genuinely beautiful in October, forgettable in February, and taxed at a rate that made the whole inheritance feel more like an obligation than a gift. Nobody in Clara's family wanted it. Her mother suggested selling immediately. Her cousin Bethany offered to manage the sale remotely if Clara didn't want to deal with the paperwork. The consensus was efficient and unanimous: unload the property before spring, put the money somewhere sensible, move forward. Clara drove out to see it on a Thursday in January, fully intending to call the realtor on Friday. She walked the property alone in weather that made her ears ache. The barn door wouldn't close properly because the frame had shifted, and inside the floorboards were soft in three places, and the light came through gaps in the roof in diagonal columns that made the whole interior look like something staged for a photograph. She stood in that cold, drafty space for 20 minutes without any particular reason to stay, then walked the back acreage to where the property line met a creek that was frozen solid and silent. She did not call the realtor on Friday. She couldn't have fully explained why. There was something about the barn's particular quality of stillness, not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness of things waiting. The way the morning light moved across those soft floorboards. She told herself it was impulsive that she'd reconsider in spring. She paid the first quarter's property tax and drove back to Boston. She kept paying the tax. She kept driving out on occasional weekends. The barn kept leaning. The property kept waiting. By April, she'd arranged a leave of absence from the firm officially for personal reassessment, a phrase her manager accepted without much probing because Clara had not taken a single personal day in 4 years. She brought her laptop, 3 boxes of books, and no plan beyond keeping the taxes current and perhaps painting the kitchen something other than the institutional beige her great-uncle had apparently considered an aesthetic choice. Raymond Polk knocked on the front door on the second Saturday in April at 7:40 in the morning. He was the operations manager at Hargrove Mill, 3 miles east on the county road, a processing facility that handled timber for flooring and commercial cabinetry. He was in his mid-50s with the kind of face that had been weather-adjusted over decades of outdoor work, not rugged in any romantic sense, just competent-looking, the way tools look competent. He did not apologize for the hour. He explained the situation without preamble. Hargrove Mill processed large volumes of hardwood. The process generated surplus material live-edge slabs with curves too irregular for standard millwork oversized pieces that wouldn't fit commercial equipment boards with mineral streaks or worm tracks or figure patterns that automated buyer specifications rejected without exception. This material had value in an abstract sense, but the market for it was diffuse, the buyers unpredictable, the logistics of selling it piece by piece more expensive than simply removing it. Hargrove had been contracting with a disposal yard 40 minutes south at $70 per load. Raymond wanted to use the back corner of her property as a drop point instead. He would pay her a monthly fee, modest, he was honest about that, and remove anything she hadn't claimed after 6 months. He was not selling her anything. He was not asking her to commit to more than a handshake agreement renewable by either party. Clara listened to all of this holding a coffee mug she'd forgotten to offer to share. Then she asked the question that would later seem in retrospect like the hinge everything else swung on. What's the wood actually worth? Raymond Polk considered the question with the patience of a man who'd answered imprecise questions carefully for 30 years. To us, a pause. Nothing we can move. The commercial buyers want uniform. Consistent grain, no mineral stain, no live edge, nothing that requires individual handling. What we're bringing you is everything that doesn't fit that definition. Clara looked past him toward the back acreage where the field went flat before dropping toward the creek. She thought about the barn with its soft floors and its waiting quality. She thought briefly about her great-uncle Harlan spending 40 years on this land growing soybeans badly. Leave the woods, she said. The first delivery came the following Tuesday. What Clara knew about maple in those early weeks could be summarized quickly. It was hard, it was valuable in finished form, and the slabs arriving on her property had something in their grain, a depth, a variation, a quality of light moving through the figure that she recognized from a decade of writing marketing copy about wood she'd never actually worked. She knew the language of it. She did not yet know the material. What she didn't know and would learn expensively was that wood is a living argument about time. A freshly cut slab carries moisture throughout its cellular structure. Not surface moisture you can see or feel, but deep fiber moisture that takes months, sometimes years to release properly. As it releases unevenly. One face dries faster than the other. One end faster than the center. The wood responds to this imbalance by moving, twisting along its length, cupping across its width, developing small cracks along the grain called checks that open from the inside out. The technical term for this process is seasoning. The practical experience of it for someone who doesn't know it's happening is betrayal. She didn't know any of this yet. In those first weeks, she watched the slabs accumulate with the particular attention of someone who has been given something they don't yet have the vocabulary to describe. George Albright leaned over the fence on a Thursday afternoon in late May when the pile had grown substantial enough that it was visible from the road. He was carrying a thermos and wearing a canvas hat that had seen enough weather to have opinions about it. "Going to have yourself a beautiful firewood collection," he said. Not unkindly. George was not a cruel man. He was a man who had spent 30 years measuring land and drawing accurate conclusions from observable data. And the observable data here, woman with no apparent woodworking background, receiving industrial quantities of raw lumber, suggested a particular outcome. Clara looked at him over the fence. She smiled the way you smile when the answer is too long to give to someone who hasn't asked a real question. "Maybe," she said. She went inside. She ordered a used bandsaw from an estate sale listing in Iowa City, then a workbench, then a router with 3 bits and a set of chisels that would need sharpening before they were useful. She did not have a plan exactly. She had the instinct that preceded a plan, the sense that something here was worth the attention required to understand it. That instinct had a source, though she hadn't consciously connected it yet to what was happening on this property in this particular April and May. The source was a workshop in New Hampshire and a man named Earl Weston, in a summer afternoon when Clara was 11 years old and genuinely believed that time moved at a consistent speed. Earl was her mother's father. He lived in a house in Grafton County that was slightly too large for one person and exactly right for the workshop he kept in the converted garage behind it. He had retired from a career in civil engineering at 62 and promptly spent the following 15 years restoring furniture that other people had given up on, chairs with split rungs, dressers, missing hardware tables, whose joints had gone dry and open. People in the county knew to leave things at the end of his driveway when they were done with them. He paid modest prices when someone asked, accepted donations when they didn't, and seemed fundamentally unbothered by the distinction. Clara had spent summers there throughout her childhood in the way that grandchildren spend summers at the houses of grandparents who have something interesting going on, not structured, not programmed, just present. She'd learned to use a hand plane before she could drive. She'd learned to identify grain direction by feel before she could articulate why it mattered. Earl hadn't taught these things formally. He'd simply worked and she'd watched, and the knowledge had transferred the way knowledge transfers best, through proximity and repetition, and the occasional question answered well. One afternoon in that particular summer, when she was 11, she'd found him in the workshop, bent over a tabletop that was warped so severely the ends curled 4 inches off the bench surface. He'd retrieved it from someone's curb the day before. She stood in the doorway watching him examine it, turning it, sighting down its length, pressing one hand flat against the worst of the curve. "Why are you even bothering?" she asked. The words came out more bluntly than she intended, the way 11-year-old questions do. "That thing is ugly." Earl didn't look up. He ran one hand along the grain, not evaluating exactly. "Reading. The way you read something you're not sure you fully understand yet, but know is worth understanding. Ugly is usually just uninformed," he said finally. He set the tabletop back on the bench and looked at her directly. "Wood doesn't have an opinion about what we think of it. The question is whether you can see past what something looks like right now to what it could become." He picked up a curl of wood shaving from the bench surface and turned it in his fingers. "Most people can't do that. That's not a character flaw, it's just attention. Where your attention goes determines what's available to you." A pause. "The people who learn to pay attention to what others have stopped looking at, they never run out of material." Clara had absorbed this at 11 the way children absorb things that are slightly too large for them, taking it in completely without being able to use it yet, the way you swallow a pill that needs time to dissolve before it works. She hadn't thought about it consciously in years, but standing in her great-uncle's back acreage in the spring of her 38th year, watching enormous maple slabs come off a hydraulic bed and hit the Iowa ground with that particular sound, something in her had recognized something. She couldn't have said what, not precisely, but she had said yes to Raymond Polk's arrangement without hesitating, and she had ordered a bandsaw, and she was paying attention. The equipment arrived in stages over the following weeks. The bandsaw went into the barn after she reinforced 2 of the softest floor sections with new boards she bought from a lumber yard in Ames. The workbench followed a solid maple piece she found at an estate sale, and considered with some irony the first piece of furniture she'd acquired in a decade that she genuinely liked. The chisels came sharpened from a tool shop in Des Moines. She spent a weekend watching instructional videos, reading 3 books on hardwood furniture construction that she'd ordered from a woodworking publisher in Pennsylvania, and taking notes in a spiral-bound notebook that she kept on the bench. She was not romantic about any of this. She did not think of herself as an artist discovering a calling. She thought of herself as a person who had identified something that other people had concluded had no value, and she wanted to know if that conclusion was correct. That was all. It was the same instinct she'd applied for 10 years in marketing. Find the misvalued thing, understand it better than the current assessment, and act on the gap between perception and reality. She was good at that. She had simply never before applied it with her hands. The first mistake was significant enough to qualify as an education. She selected the best slab in the current pile, a piece of hard maple 32 inches across and 7 feet long with a figure in the grain that she would later learn was called curly maple. The fibers growing in waves that caught light differently depending on angle, the surface seeming to shift as you move past it. She'd been watching it for 3 weeks. It was the piece she most wanted to do something worthwhile with. She ran it through the bandsaw to establish a flat reference face. The cut was rough but manageable. She spent 2 evenings flattening the surface with a hand plane, following the grain direction she'd read about moving carefully. By the end of the second evening, the surface was genuinely flat, genuinely smooth, the kind of surface that holds light evenly and makes you want to run your hand across it. She cut the legs, she built the apron, she spent 4 days on the joinery cutting mortise and tenon joints by hand because the books had been specific about the superiority of hand-cut joinery for live-edge pieces with irregular dimensions. The joints were not perfect. The tenons were slightly oversized in 2 places, and she had to pare them down by feel, which was imprecise, which meant the fit was merely good rather than excellent. She noted this without discouragement. For a first attempt, good was acceptable. She glued the base together, clamped it overnight, and let it cure for 36 hours before she trusted it with the top. The top went on with construction adhesive and wood screws countersunk below the surface, the holes to be filled with maple plugs once everything was cured. She set it up in the barn under the work light and stood back. It looked like a real table, not a practice piece, not a study, but an object you could put things on, could gather around, could pass down. The curly maple top caught the work light and threw the figure back at her in that shifting way she would never entirely stop finding surprising, no matter how many hundreds of hours she eventually spent with figured maple. The base was solid, the proportions were reasonable. She had made something. She went to bed satisfied. On the 3rd morning after completion, she came into the barn to find a crack running the full length of the table's center. It was not a hairline crack. It was not a surface check of the kind the books described as normal. It was a split, a genuine structural failure. The tabletop having separated from itself along the medullary rays, the crack running from one end and opening wide enough that she could see the grain direction reversing itself across the gap. The top had cupped slightly as well, the edges lifting a fraction of an inch off the base. The whole piece looked like something that had tried to become itself and failed halfway through the attempt. She stood in the cold barn holding a coffee mug, looking at the split. She did not take out her phone to call anyone. There was no one obvious to call. She did not go back inside to avoid looking at it. She stood there for a long time, the way you stand with a conclusion you're not entirely ready to have. Then she went inside and opened the books. The answer was in the 3rd chapter of the most technical volume she'd ordered under a section heading she'd skimmed past the first time because she'd thought it applied to other species. Green wood. Moisture content. The fact that a freshly cut slab contains 40 to 80% moisture by weight, and that this moisture does not leave the wood evenly or quickly, and that the standard rule for air drying 1 year per inch of thickness was not a suggestion offered by cautious people. It was a physical requirement imposed by the cellular structure of the material. The slab she'd worked had been sitting in Iowa weather for 4 months. It was not dry. It had never been close to dry. She had built a table from a piece of wood that was still, in the most meaningful sense, in the process of deciding what shape it intended to be. The crack was not a failure of her joinery or her technique. The crack was the wood finishing a conversation she hadn't known was happening. She read for 3 hours straight. She ordered a moisture meter. She identified a woodworker named Dean Whitfield, who had a shop in Grafton County, New Hampshire, the same county where Earl had kept his workshop, whose name appeared in 3 separate online forums as someone willing to talk through problems with people who were serious about learning. She sent him a message that was specific about what had happened, what she'd done wrong, and what she needed to understand. Dean Whitfield wrote back in 2 sentences. The wood wins every argument you have with its nature. Come up if you want to stop arguing. She drove to New Hampshire the following weekend. Dean's shop was smaller than she expected and better organized than she thought possible. He was in his early 70s, lean with hands that moved around wood, the way hands move around things they have spent decades understanding. He did not waste time on preamble. He showed her the moisture meter and what the numbers meant. He showed her winding sticks, two parallel strips of wood placed at either end of a slab to reveal twists the human eye couldn't detect on its own, the stick's ends going out of alignment in proportion to the wood's deviation from flat. He showed her how to read grain direction before any cut, running a thumbnail lightly along the surface and feeling for the subtle resistance that told you which way the fibers ran and therefore which way a plane or chisel needed to travel. Maple is specific, Dean said at one point, holding a slab up to the shop's north-facing window so the light hit it at a low angle. The figure in the grain shifted as he tilted it a shimmer a depth, like looking at water from the side. It's dense, unforgiving of technique that would be acceptable in softer species. But when you get the conditions right, he tilted the board again and the figure moved again. There's no wood that rewards the attention more. She drove back to Iowa with notes covering 14 pages of a legal pad. Back in Calder Mills, the slabs continued arriving every Tuesday. The pile grew through summer and into fall, the older pieces at the bottom beginning the long, slow process of releasing moisture into the air of an Iowa field. She checked their moisture content weekly with the meter she'd ordered. She kept a log. The numbers moved in the direction of workable slowly, with the maddening patience of natural processes, and she noted them and waited. She did not wait passively. She worked with the pieces that had been in the pile longest, the ones closest to the bottom, the ones that had arrived in the first month. She made mistakes. The apron on her second table was slightly cocked. She'd rushed the clamping. She refined the technique. The finish on the third piece blushed white within 48 hours of application. She'd applied oil in humidity above 60%, and the moisture trapped beneath the finish had nowhere to go. She stripped it, sanded back to bare wood, waited 3 days for drier conditions, and refinished. The result was better than she'd have achieved without the failure. Every mistake was a specific piece of information that no book had delivered as effectively. The books could tell her what to avoid. Only the mistakes could show her why avoidance mattered, what was actually at stake, what the consequences looked and felt like, what the material did when you got something wrong. George Albright watched through November with the patience of a man who believed that observation was its own form of productivity. He'd adjusted his assessment slightly. The pieces he caught glimpses of through the barn door were clearly not firewood, were clearly something with more intentionality behind them. But his fundamental conclusion remained. This was a hobby, and hobbies did not become enterprises. And the woman with the marketing background who'd inherited 12 acres of rock-heavy Iowa soil was going to have a pleasant creative outlet until she ran out of enthusiasm or money, whichever came first. He was reasonable to think so. The evidence at that point supported his assessment. What the evidence couldn't account for was something that didn't show up in observable data. The quality of attention Clara Weston had brought to this barn, to these slabs, to the slow, expensive, repeating lessons of a material that didn't care about her timeline. Attention of that kind doesn't announce itself. It doesn't produce visible results on any schedule that satisfies outside observers. It accumulates below the surface the way moisture leaves wood, steadily, invisibly, until one day the numbers are different and something has changed that you can measure. On a Tuesday morning in December, the Hargrove truck came down the gravel path in light snow. Clara stood on the back porch with her mug barn boots and a canvas coat, watching the driver lower the bed. The slabs came down onto the frozen ground with that sound she'd come to organize her weeks around, that particular percussion of something heavy meeting solid earth carrying across the white field to the barn and back. She set down the mug. She walked across the field to the new pile. She found a slab near the top ash-white maple 40 inches across the bark edge, curving along one side in a long arc. She ran her thumb along the end grain, read the growth rings the way she'd learned to read them, counted years of growth in the density of the pattern. Then she took out the moisture meter, pressed the pins into the wood, and read the number. Too high. Still weeks, maybe months from workable. She noted it in the log she kept in her coat pocket. Around her, the field was quiet and white and indifferent to everything she was doing on it. The barn behind her held at that point 3 completed tables, imperfect, each one better than the last. None of them yet what she was reaching toward. The pile of slabs in front of her represented months of future work material that had value she couldn't yet fully unlock, that was engaged in its own slow process of becoming. She stood there for a moment in the cold, in the particular stillness of a December morning in Iowa, and thought about her grandfather's workshop in New Hampshire, and a warped tabletop on a curb, and the way his hand had moved across the grain before he answered a question she'd asked without understanding it. The ones who pay attention never run out of material. She put the log back in her pocket. She walked to the barn. She picked up the hand plane she'd left at the end of the bench, checked the blade, adjusted the mouth with 2 turns of the adjuster, and went back to work. The moisture meter became the instrument by which Clara measured time. Not calendar time that moved the way it always had, indifferently in 30-day increments, that meant nothing to a slab of hard maple still working through its own internal argument about whether to stay flat. The time that mattered was the time inside the wood, the slow migration of moisture from fiber to fiber toward the surface, where it could finally release into the Iowa air. She checked the numbers every week. She logged them in the spiral notebook with the date, the slab's position in the pile, the ambient humidity. The numbers moved in fractions. Some weeks they barely moved at all. She logged them anyway. Iowa winter has a specific quality of stillness that people who haven't experienced it tend to underestimate. It isn't the dramatic stillness of mountain snow. It's flatter, more thorough a quiet that settles over the fields like a second sky. Clara worked in it without complaint. She reinforced the barn's north wall against drafts. She strung additional work lighting from the rafters until the interior held enough light to read grain direction without squinting. She bought a cast iron wood stove secondhand from a farm auction outside Ames, had a neighbor help her run the flue through the roof, and discovered that a heated barn in January made the difference between woodworking as suffering and woodworking as practice. The distinction mattered. Practice required returning to the bench willingly without the friction of physical misery layered on top of the cognitive difficulty of learning a new material. She was already providing herself enough difficulty through incompetence. She didn't need to add frostbite. The second table's apron problem occupied 2 weeks of her thinking before she understood it. The apron pieces, the horizontal rails connecting the legs below the tabletop, had gone together looking correct. She'd checked them with a square. She'd clamped them true. Something in the clamping sequence had introduced a twist she couldn't see until the glue dried, and then it was permanent. The table sat slightly racked on a flat floor, one corner lifting a hair off the surface every time she set it down. She didn't try to fix it. She built it again from scratch this time, clamping one joint at a time, checking with winding sticks after each stage building in the patience that the first attempt had treated as optional. The second version sat flat. The joints were cleaner. The proportions were fractionally better because she'd spent 2 weeks looking at the first version's failures and knew specifically what to improve. This was the education that Dean Whitfield had gestured toward without fully describing, not because he'd withheld anything, but because it couldn't be described without being experienced. You could tell a person that furniture was a system of controlled tensions, that wood moved seasonally, that the clamps were only as good as the preparation they secured. You could tell them all of this accurately. The information would sit in the mind like furniture in a locked room, technically present, functionally inaccessible, until the moment a specific failure made specific the reason it mattered. Then it opened. Then you owned it in a way no amount of reading had produced. By March of the second year, Clara had completed 8 pieces. None of them were what she intended to make eventually. All of them were better than the one before. She kept 5 in the barn, 2 tables, a bench, a pair of side chairs whose proportions she'd worked through 3 iterations to get right, and broke down the others for parts, salvaging the usable components, studying the failed joints like a doctor reviewing a diagnosis that had turned out to be wrong. Spring brought the fields back from white to brown to tentative green, and with it a category of problem. Clara hadn't fully anticipated people began stopping to look. Not buyers, not yet. Curious neighbors, people who drove the county road regularly and had watched the maple pile grow through winter, who'd heard something secondhand about what was happening in the old Harlan Place's barn. A woman from down the road knocked one Saturday morning to ask if she could see what Clara was working on. Clara showed her. The woman ran her hand across the figured maple top of the better table, said, "Oh my," in a voice that contained genuine surprise, and left without asking any of the follow-up questions that would have indicated she was a serious buyer. The interaction repeated itself in variations throughout spring. People came curious. People admired. Nobody opened a checkbook because nobody had reached that stage of the mental process, the stage where admiration converts to transaction, where the hand that touches a surface begins calculating whether the feeling is worth the price that making such a surface required. Clara understood this from her decade in marketing. The gap between "this is beautiful" and "I will pay for this" was not a gap of information. It was a gap of context. People needed to understand what they were buying, why it cost what it cost, why this piece rather than a piece from a furniture store with a parking lot and a financing offer. She knew how to build that context. She had spent 10 years doing exactly that for other people's products. What she didn't have yet was a venue. The work was real, but it was invisible, sitting in a barn on a county road in Calder Mills, Iowa, available only to people who happened to drive past and happened to be curious. For the work to find the people who would understand it, she needed to put it somewhere those people already went. She loaded 4 pieces into her truck the following April, 2 years after Raymond Polk's first delivery, and drove to a regional craft market in a town called Renner, 40 miles north. The market occupied a fairground pavilion on Saturdays in spring, the kind of venue that hosted quilts, pottery, hand-dyed textiles, cutting boards sold by men who discovered woodworking 3 months ago. Clara paid the table fee, set up the pieces on the grass outside the pavilion where the light was better, and waited. She sold nothing. She drove home with the truck loaded exactly as it had been loaded at 6 that morning. She unloaded everything back into the barn, returned the pieces to their positions, went inside, made dinner. She noted the experience in the spiral notebook, not as a failure but as a data point. The market's existing customer base was oriented toward lower price points. The venue's foot traffic was primarily local and oriented toward the familiar. The presentation context hadn't matched the product's register. She needed a different venue or a different approach to the same venue, or both. She went back the following month. Different position, she moved to the end of the row nearest the parking entrance where people passed before they'd committed to a direction. She brought a different selection, the best table she'd made to that point. A live-edge coffee table with a base she'd cut from the dried lower section of an early slab, the legs slightly angled outward in a design she'd worked out over a week of sketches. She brought 2 smaller pieces, a pair of side tables with the kind of proportions that looked simple, until you measured them and discovered they were anything but. A woman in her early 60s stopped in front of the coffee table. She ran her hand across the surface the way Earl had run his hand across the warped tabletop Clara remembered from that New Hampshire workshop. Not casually with the back of the fingers, but deliberately with the palm flat, reading the wood through. Touch the way certain people read everything important. She stood there for a long moment. Then she walked away. Clara watched her go. She felt the specific frustration of someone who has produced something real and watched it fail to complete its intended connection. The piece was right. The woman had felt it. Something in the space between them. Price context, the unfamiliarity of buying something of this nature from a folding table at a county fairground had interrupted the circuit. She went back a 3rd month. The same woman came back. She did not pause at the coffee table this time. She bought it. $240 a number Clara had arrived at by calculating material cost, the depreciation on equipment, a conservative estimate of her labor hours, then reducing all of that by a margin she was embarrassed to think about because she understood intellectually that she was underpricing, but couldn't yet make herself charge what the work actually cost. $240. The couple who bought it was renovating a farmhouse outside Burlington, Vermont. They'd driven to Iowa to visit family and found the market by accident. And they recognized the piece for what it was, because the farmhouse they were renovating had original pine floors from 1887 that they'd been treating with the same careful attention. They understood what they were buying. They knew why it cost what it cost. They said so, and Clara heard them say it and filed that information alongside the understanding that her market was not the fairground in Renner. It was the specific kind of person who showed up at fairgrounds in Renner by accident while visiting from Vermont. Word moved in the sideways manner of small communities and niche markets. The couple posted photographs of the coffee table in their renovated farmhouse live-edge maple against wide pine floors, morning light coming through restored windows at a low angle, the kind of image that accumulated attention on the platforms where people who cared about such things spent their time. A coffee shop in Montpelier, Vermont reached out 3 weeks later. They were redoing their interior, wanted 2 cafe tables with matching bench tops had seen. The photograph was this person still making furniture. Clara built the tables. She quoted 6 weeks. She delivered in 5, loading the truck at 4 in the morning for the drive across 3 states to Montpellier, setting the tables up in the east-facing windows, the owner specified while the baristas prepped for the morning rush. The owner set a latte on the nearer table while Clara was still adjusting a leg leveler. The light came through the window at the right angle. The figured maple surface did what figured maple surfaces do in that quality of light it caught and returned the morning in a way that manufactured surfaces simply could not, the curly figure moving as the sun moved. The owner said nothing for a moment. Then, "Come back when you're in the area. These aren't going anywhere." They weren't. The photograph started within a week, customers shooting their morning drinks against the tabletops, without thinking about why the background was more interesting than the usual surfaces. They were thinking about the light, the texture, the grain. They were not thinking about Clara in a barn in Iowa, working through her 3rd year of learning what wood required. The joint failure happened in the 22nd month. Clara had her largest order to that point, 2 cafe tables for a coffee shop in Burlington, Vermont. Different from the Montpelier shop, a referral from the owner there, the order worth $480. She worked carefully. She selected the slabs from the pile with the most age on them, checking moisture content over 3 consecutive weeks to confirm stability. The joinery was better than anything she'd done before. The mortise and tenon connections on the base were cut to a tolerance that required a rubber mallet to close, which was correct, which was what she'd been aiming at for 2 years. She glued on a Tuesday. She clamped through Wednesday. She pulled the clamps Thursday morning and set the tables on the flat floor of the barn to check for rack. Both sat perfectly. She ran her hand across both tops, flat smooth, the finish she'd developed over months of testing a thin oil base. 2 coats of hard wax, buffed between, giving the surface the quality of something that had always been this way rather than something made. She loaded the truck Friday morning and drove to Burlington, 400 miles, arriving at 3 in the afternoon. The coffee shop owner met her at the back entrance. They carried the tables in together, set them where the owner had marked the floor with tape. The owner stepped back. Clara stepped back. Both of them looked at the tables in the afternoon light coming through the shop's east windows. The first table was correct. It sat level. The proportions worked with the room. The figured maple top reflected the window light in the way that made people stop and look at their coffee before they drank it. The second table had a joint beginning to open at the rear left leg connection. It was not dramatic. It was not a failure you'd notice unless you were looking for it. A hairline separation at the shoulder of the tenon, the glue line visible as a thread of lighter color against the darker maple. Clara saw it in the moment the owner's eyes moved to the first table. She crossed to the second table, crouched, looked at the joint from below. The gap was real. It was going to widen. She understood what had happened before she could fully accept that it had happened. The Tuesday she'd glued was the tail end of a weather system that had pushed ambient humidity in the barn above 70%. She'd checked the moisture content of the wood. She had not checked the barn's humidity level before spreading the glue. The adhesive had cured in conditions that prevented proper penetration into the wood fibers, and the joint that looked perfect to all visible evidence was a joint that had never fully bonded. The owner was still looking at the first table. Clara stood up. She explained what she'd found, the exact nature of the problem, the specific cause, what she intended to do about it. She said she would take the second table back, repair the joint under controlled conditions, deliver it within 2 weeks at no additional cost. She said she understood if the owner wanted to reconsider the order entirely. The owner looked at the second table, then at Clara. The silence lasted long enough to require counting. "Take it back," the owner said. "Bring me something I can put in the window." Clara loaded the second table and drove 400 miles home in the dark. What she hadn't anticipated, what no amount of professional experience had prepared her for, was the review. The owner had a business to run. A table she'd paid for hadn't been delivered as agreed. She wrote about it on a local Burlington community page, factual but unsparing, ordered furniture from a craftsperson in Iowa, one piece delivered with a structural defect currently awaiting resolution. The post attracted 43 comments in 3 days, the typical community board ratio of sympathy and judgment, several people sharing their own experiences with commissioned furniture that hadn't been right. The post did not disappear. Community board posts have a specific longevity, not viral, not spreading, but findable, sitting there at the top of a search result for anyone who went looking. Clara found the post on Saturday morning. She read it twice. She closed her laptop. She went to the barn. The second table sat near the doors, where she'd left it after unloading at midnight. She looked at it in the morning light, the failed joint catching the angle in a way that made it visible from 5 feet without crouching. The first table was in Burlington in a coffee shop window, doing exactly what she'd built it to do. The second table was here with a flaw that was her fault, not the wood's decision, not a material failure, but her own failure to check one variable she knew to check. She sat down on the barn floor back against the workbench. The morning was cold despite the stove. She held a coffee mug with both hands. In the 16 months since Raymond Polk had first knocked on her door, she had spent money she'd saved carefully over a decade of marketing work. The bandsaw, the bench, the router, the chisels, the moisture meter, the stove, the additional lighting, the lumberyard lumber for structural repairs to the barn itself, the estate sale tools, the fuel for 2 multi-state drives. She had sold one coffee table for $240. She had one outstanding invoice for $480 that was currently in dispute because one of the 2 tables it covered had a failed joint. She had a review on a community board that was at that moment making its way through the awareness of anyone in Burlington, Vermont, who had been considering commissioning furniture from someone in Iowa they'd found through a chain of social media photographs. She thought about calling Raymond Polk. She had his number in her phone from the original arrangement. She had thought about the call at 2 other points in the previous 16 months after the first table split from moisture, after the finish blushed white on the third piece, but those had been technical failures, learning events, the cost of education. This was different. This was a customer's valid complaint publicly stated about a piece she delivered without adequate quality control. She thought about selling the property. The market had improved since she'd inherited it. She could pay the remaining property taxes, take what equity had accumulated, and use it to do something else. She was 39. She had 10 years of marketing experience. She could go back to Boston. She could start over in a direction that involved less split wood and fewer 400-mile drives in the dark. She sat with that possibility the way you sit with a door you're considering opening, not theatrically, not with obvious drama, just turning the handle in your mind and seeing how it feels. It felt like giving something back before she knew what it was. She stood up. She took the failed table to the bench. She broke down the joint, carefully removing the apron rail without damaging the leg, cleaning the dried adhesive from both surfaces with a cabinet scraper until the bare wood was exposed. She checked the barn's humidity on the meter she'd ordered after the Burlington incident. 51%, within tolerance. She recut the 10-inch shoulders by a hair on each side, not because the dimensions were wrong, but because she wanted fresh wood on the glue surfaces. She spread the adhesive at the correct thickness, worked it into both surfaces with a brush assembled. The joint clamped it with the precise pressure she learned, produced full closure without starving the glue line. She set a timer for 24 hours. She did not sleep well that night, but she slept. The joint cured correctly. She checked it the next morning with a dental pick along the glue line, clean, fully closed, no separation. She refinished the affected area, feathered the wax coat into the surrounding surface until the repair was invisible to touch. She loaded the table, drove back to Burlington, and carried it into the coffee shop on a Wednesday morning. The owner looked at the repaired piece beside its partner. Both tables now in the east windows, the morning light doing what morning light does to figured maple. She said nothing for a moment. "The review's still up," she said finally. Her voice wasn't apologetic. It wasn't punitive. It was simply a statement of fact. Clara nodded slowly. "It should be." It was accurate. The owner looked at her. Something shifted in the quality of that look, not warmth exactly. Recognition. The kind that passes between people who understand that honest accounting costs something and respect others who are willing to pay it. The tables stayed. The review stayed. Customers photographed their lattes against those surfaces without knowing about the failed joint, the 400-mile night drive, the repair that had taken a week of Clara's sleep. They photographed the beauty, which was real. They didn't photograph the cost, which was also real. One of those photographs landed in front of Lenora Quill. Clara didn't know Lenora existed yet. She was back in Calder Mills working through the implications of what the Burlington situation had taught her. The lesson wasn't simply technical check ambient humidity before gluing. She'd added that to the checklist she kept on a clipboard above the bench. The deeper lesson was about the nature of the gap between almost right and right. In marketing, almost right was frequently sufficient. A campaign that was 85% on target still moved product. The 10 or 15% that missed was invisible in aggregate results. In furniture, there was no aggregate. There was this joint, this surface, this piece, one object, one customer, one outcome. Almost right was another way of saying wrong. The tolerance for approximation that she'd been trained in for a decade was not available to her here, and internalizing that difference required more than understanding it intellectually. She refined her process through the third year with the methodical patience of someone who had learned in a specific and irreversible way what lack of patience produced. She built a checklist that covered every stage from initial slab selection through final delivery moisture content of each piece at 3 intervals, before cutting ambient humidity on gluing day's joint fit, before adhesive application clamping sequence documented in the log. She added steps that felt excessive until she remembered the Burlington drive in the dark, and then they didn't feel excessive at all. The work improved in a way that became visible to people who saw it without being told what to look for. This was the measure that mattered, not technical improvement, which she could track herself, but the quality of attention from people who had no investment in being generous. The third year brought smaller sales enough to confirm the direction without resolving the underlying question of whether a sustainable enterprise was actually available here or whether she was building towards something that would remain permanently marginal. A side table to a woman in Des Moines who'd seen the Montpelier photographs through a chain of 3 social media shares. A console table to a couple in Chicago who drove to Calder Mills specifically to see the barn and left with the piece she'd been most reluctant to sell. A set of nesting tables to a retired teacher in Ames who'd read about Clara in the county newspaper's quarterly feature on local businesses and arrived with photographs of her living room so they could work out placement before committing. Each sale confirmed something. None of them resolved the larger question. George Albright adjusted his assessment again quietly without making it explicit. He'd seen the Chicago couple drive up in a car with Illinois plates and carry something wrapped in moving blankets to their trunk. He'd seen the woman from Des Moines spend 40 minutes in the barn. He stopped making the firewood remark. He hadn't revised his fundamental skepticism. This was still, in his considered view, an enterprise that would plateau before it became real. But the evidence was no longer as simple as it had been. Clara saw his adjusted silence and found it more useful than his commentary had been. Skepticism that modifies in response to evidence is a different thing from skepticism that doesn't. George Albright watching without the running commentary meant he was actually watching, which meant she had an honest observer instead of a foregone conclusion. She did not explain this to him. She brought him coffee occasionally when he was at the fence. The maple pile kept growing every Tuesday. The pieces in the barn kept improving. The log in the spiral notebook kept filling up with numbers that moved in one direction. By the end of the third year, the barn held 11 finished pieces she hadn't sold yet. The oldest of the slabs in the pile, the ones from those first Tuesday deliveries, were reading moisture content in the single digits. Bone dry, ready. The curly figure in those early slabs had been developing for 36 months under Iowa sky. The cells fully released the wood dimensionally stable in a way that made the earlier pieces feel, in comparison, like they'd been made from something still deciding what it wanted to be. She selected the best of the early slabs one February morning. It was 42 inches wide, 7 feet long, the curl in the grain so pronounced it seemed to move when you picked up a light source and walked past it. She'd been looking at this piece for 3 years. She knew where every mineral streak ran, where the grain reversed near the right edge, where the bark inclusion on the live edge had healed around a small knot, and created a figure that had no name she'd found in any book. She set it on the bench. She took out the moisture meter, pressed the pins in at 3 points along the length. Read the numbers, wrote them in the log. Workable. Finally, fully workable. She picked up the hand plane, checked the blade with her thumb sharp enough to shave, set it to a fine cut, positioned herself at the end of the slab with the grain direction she knew by now without thinking. The first stroke produced a curl of maple so thin the light came through it. She held it for a moment between 2 fingers, translucent. The kind of evidence that arrives not as argument, but as demonstration. The wood had been waiting, not resisting, just completing a process that operated on its own schedule, and asked only that the person on the other end be patient enough to meet it there. She set the shaving down. She went back to work. In Burlington, 2 cafe tables sat in east-facing windows. On a Thursday morning in late March, a woman named Lenora Quill sat at the nearer one, opened her laptop, and photographed her coffee against the figured maple surface before she opened any documents. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the surface it had captured. She set down the coffee. She asked the barista where the tables had come from. Lenora Quill did not call ahead. This was characteristic of how she operated. As Clara would learn later, Lenora moved through the world with the efficiency of someone whose time had been genuinely scarce, for long enough that preliminary phone calls felt like a luxury she'd stopped affording. She handled interior design for cabin renovations across 5 northeastern states, always overbooked, always managing 3 clients who believed they were her only client. She had seen the photograph of her own coffee against that Burlington tabletop, had asked the barista a single question, had written a name on a napkin, had driven to Iowa on a Tuesday. She arrived at the barn at 9:15 in the morning, which was the same morning the Hargrove truck had come down the gravel path with a new load. Clara was still outside when Lenora's car turned off Route 9, a gray sedan with Vermont plates moving with the purposeful slowness of someone reading address numbers. Lenora got out without looking at the maple pile. She looked at Clara. "You made the Burlington tables." Not a question. Clara was still holding the moisture meter she'd picked up to check the new delivery. "I did." Lenora walked past her into the barn. She spent 12 minutes moving through the inventory without speaking. She touched surfaces the way people touch things they're seriously considering buying. Not the stroking admiration of casual visitors, but the deliberate pressure of someone assessing structural reality, checking for deviation from flat reading edges, for consistency of finish. She lifted the smaller of the 2 side tables Claire had built from the first truly dry slab, turned it upside down, examined the joinery from below. She set it back down precisely where she'd found it. Lead time on a dining set, 6 chairs table to seat 8 comfortably. Clara did the calculation, the slab selection, the drying confirmation, the joinery on 8 chairs requiring more time than the table itself. 6 weeks. Lenora looked at the inventory one more time, then back at Clara. "Make it 8. I'd rather wait than rush something that shouldn't be rushed." She placed an order for the dining set, a console table, 2 side tables before she drove back to Vermont. The deposit she left covered Clara's equipment costs for the next 4 months. She did not negotiate price. Clara had quoted for the first time numbers that reflected actual labor. Lenora had looked at them and said, "That's fair." 2 words that landed with the particular weight of validation that comes from someone who knows what they're talking about. Clara stood in the barn after Lenora's car disappeared up the gravel path. She looked at the inventory at the workbench, at the spiral notebook on its hook above the bench, where 3 years of logged numbers filled every page. She looked at the new slab from the morning's delivery still sitting where the driver had left it near the doors. She picked up the moisture meter. She checked the new slab out of habit, 2 high weeks from workable. She noted it in the log. Then she went to the bench. She had 8 weeks to build a dining set that would live in a Vermont cabin and be seen by every client Lenora Quill brought through it. Lenora's network operated the way networks operate when someone at the center of them is genuinely competent through trust transferred rather than marketing applied. Within a month of the dining set commission, Clara received a call from a developer in Woodstock, Vermont, who said Lenora had mentioned her name. Then a call from an architect in Portland, Maine, who'd seen the Montpelier Cafe tables on a visit and tracked the maker through 3 separate inquiries. Then an email from a woman in Western Massachusetts who was building a house on a hillside and wanted to talk about what was possible with live edge material for a kitchen island. Clara answered every inquiry with the same information she'd given Lenora: lead time, price, what the material required. Some people heard the lead time and withdrew. She didn't adjust the timeline to accommodate them. The timeline was what the work required, not what her schedule permitted. This distinction had taken 3 years to internalize, but once internalized, it was non-negotiable. A joint cured when it cured. A surface was ready when the numbers said it was ready. The customer's calendar was not a variable she could build into her process without breaking the process. The Lenora dining set delivered in week 7, 1 week ahead of schedule, because the slabs she'd selected had been in the pile long enough to be fully stable, because her joinery was now clean enough that assembly didn't require correction, because she'd learned to work with the material's pace rather than against it. She drove to Vermont on a Thursday, set the table in the cabin's main room with its north-facing window wall, placed 6 chairs around it, stepped back. Lenora walked in from the adjacent room. She looked at the table for a long moment. She pulled out one of the chairs, sat down in it, put both hands flat on the tabletop. She looked at the surface from chair height, the angle at which the dining set would be experienced most of its life. "When can you do another one?" That was the entire review, the entire transaction summary, the entire statement of satisfaction. Clara understood it as the highest available form of professional praise from someone constitutionally incapable of wasting words on sentiment. Garrett Fenn came into Clara's awareness on a Tuesday morning in October of the fourth year, which was to say he arrived at the moment the Hargrove truck was working its way down the gravel path. He'd heard about Clara from Lenora, not a referral exactly. More an observation Lenora had made in conversation while they were discussing specifications for a property he was developing in the Champlain Valley. He built high-end cabin properties across the Northeast, 6 to 8 properties per year, each one positioned at the upper end of the vacation rental market. He'd been struggling, Lenora had told him directly, with the furniture problem. Everything specified to his price point looked like it had been selected from a catalog because it had been. The spaces were beautiful at the level of architecture, then deflated at the level of furnishing. Lenora had mentioned a name. Garrett was 58 years old, with the compressed patience of a man who'd spent 3 decades negotiating construction timelines, material costs, contractor relationships, the specific misalignments between what architects drew and what builders could produce. He pulled up in a truck of his own rather than the kind of car developers sometimes drove to make a point about their position. He got out. He looked at the Hargrove truck, completing its delivery. He watched the slab come off the hydraulic bed. He watched Clara walk to it without hurrying, crouch down, run her hand along the end grain. He watched her take the moisture meter from her coat pocket, press the pins in, read the number, write it in the notebook she kept there. He watched all of this before she looked up and noticed him standing at the edge of the gravel path. "The mill pays you to take these." His voice carried genuine curiosity rather than the skepticism the question might have contained in a different tone. Clara stood. "They pay me a fee to use the space. What I do with the material is my arrangement." Garrett looked at the pile, which at that point represented 42 months of Tuesday deliveries, the older slabs darkening in their lower positions, the newest still pale with retained moisture. He looked at the barn. He walked past Clara to the barn doors without asking permission, which Clara noted not as rudeness, but as the behavior of someone who already knew whether he was going to be here for 5 minutes or 5 years and was saving everyone's time by acting accordingly. He moved through the inventory the way Lenore had systematically, without theatrical admiration, with the specific attention of someone assessing whether a thing was what it appeared to be or merely appeared to be what it appeared to be. He spent longer on the dining set commission piece. Clara hadn't yet delivered a second set similar to Lenora's, ordered by the Portland architect for a client's coastal Maine property. He crouched to examine the chair joinery. He stood pressed down on the corner of the table with his full weight checking for rack. The table didn't move. He walked back to the barn doors. He looked at the maple pile again. He looked at the barn's expanded interior. Clara had reinforced the floor throughout the previous winter, added a second run of overhead lighting along the south wall, brought in a wide belt sander that had changed the flattening process from a 2-day hand plane operation to a 4-hour controlled one. "Can you scale this?" The question was direct without preamble, the kind of question that doesn't dress itself up because the person asking it has no interest in the conversation that precedes the actual conversation. Clara had thought about this. She'd thought about it since the second Lenora commission, when she'd first begun to feel the gap between what her hands could produce alone and what the incoming inquiry volume suggested the work could support. "I'd need help. The right help, people who understand the material, not people I'd have to train from nothing." Garrett looked at her with the particular steadiness of someone doing arithmetic in real time. "Then get help. I have 6 properties furnishing in the next 18 months. Not catalog furniture. I want pieces that look like they were always supposed to be in those rooms. I want the story of where the material came from to be part of what I'm selling to the people who rent those cabins." He named a figure for a preliminary order, 4 complete room sets across 2 properties to start. The figure was specific, far higher than anything Clara had invoiced in 4 years of work. He wasn't rescuing her. He was making a business decision based on available evidence, the way business people make decisions when they've seen enough to know what they're looking at. Clara said she needed a week to confirm she could staff it correctly before committing. Garrett gave her his card. "A week is fine. I've been waiting 3 years to find this. Another week is nothing." He drove back up the gravel path. Clara stood in the barn doorway watching the dust settle after his truck. She counted the current inventory, the active commissions, the incoming inquiries, the realistic output of one person working alone in a barn in Iowa. She did the arithmetic Garrett had done in reverse, not what was possible now, but what would need to be true for what he was describing to be possible. Cole Dunbar was 34, his brother Roy 31. They'd grown up in Polk County, Iowa, in a family that had spent 3 generations restoring agricultural buildings, barns, granaries, equipment sheds, the kind of structures that predated modern construction methods and required people who understood how older materials behaved. Cole had framed houses for 8 years. Roy had spent 5 years doing finished carpentry for a contractor in Ames before the contractor retired. They'd been running their own small restoration business for 2 years, picking up work county by county, their reputation built on the specific quality of showing up when they said they would and doing what they said they'd do. Clara had met Cole the previous winter when he'd helped her run the wood stove flue. She'd watched him work. She'd noted the way he read the barn's existing structure before touching it, adjusting his approach based on what the building told him about how it had been put together. She'd filed that observation in the category of information she didn't have an immediate use for, but suspected she would. She called him the morning after Garrett's visit. Cole came out that evening with Roy. Clara showed them the inventory, the active commissions, the new inquiry log she'd started keeping when the volume exceeded what she could hold in her head. She explained what the material required, the patience it demanded, the precision. It rewarded the specific failures that came from treating it like something other than what it was. She didn't soft-pedal the difficulty. She'd spent 4 years learning what it cost to treat this work casually, and she had no interest in bringing people in who would repeat those costs. Cole listened to all of this, then walked to the workbench and picked up the hand plane she'd left there that afternoon. He turned it over, checked the blade, adjusted the mouth with 2 turns of the adjuster, the same adjustment in the same sequence that Clara did instinctively. He set it back down. Roy and I have been looking for something to get into that isn't going anywhere, Cole said. Every barn in this county gets restored once. This, he nodded toward the maple pile visible through the barn doors, keeps arriving every Tuesday. They agreed on terms that evening. Clara had spent enough time in marketing to understand that compensation structured correctly was a form of alignment. People who shared in the value they created had fundamentally different relationships to quality than people who were paid regardless of outcome. The terms reflected this. The expansion of the barn happened over a winter. Cole's understanding of the building's structure meant the reinforcement went in correctly. The first time new posts along the south wall, a properly engineered floor capable of supporting the additional equipment, Wade electrical service upgraded to handle the wide belt sander, a second finishing station built at the north end with better ventilation. Roy rebuilt the barn doors so they sealed properly, ending the drafts that had made the finishing environment inconsistent through 3 winters of Clara working alone. The barn that emerged from that winter was not a different place. It was the same place operating at a different capacity, the way a person is the same person after they've learned something significant. Recognizable, continuous, but functioning at a level that makes the earlier version look like a rehearsal. The Hargrove material, the irregular slabs, the mineral streak boards, the live edge pieces with preserved bark. The oversized sections too wide for any commercial milling operation was now inventory in the truest sense. Not material waiting to be figured out, but material waiting to be matched to commissions. Each piece's specific character tracked in a log that had evolved from a spiral notebook to a documented system with photographs, moisture readings at multiple dates, grain direction notes, figure descriptions. A designer in New York reached out about a specific piece she'd seen in a photograph of Garrett's first completed cabin, a slab with a mineral streak running diagonally across 1/3 of the surface, blue-gray against the amber maple, a visual accident of the tree's growth that no manufacturing process could replicate. Clara matched it to a commission. The designer called it perfect. It was perfect. Perfection in this case was the result of having cataloged accurately and waited long enough. Weston and Earl Company had been the business's name since Clara registered it in the 3rd year Earl for her grandfather, whose hand on a warped tabletop she still carried as the clearest image of what this work was actually about. By the end of year 4, the name appeared in 3 regional design publications. One national shelter magazine's Makers to Watch section, a Vermont tourism feature about cabin experiences that mentioned Garrett's properties specifically. Clara had not sought any of this coverage. It arrived as a consequence of the work being in the world, in places where people who wrote about such things encountered it. She was not comfortable with the coverage exactly. It introduced a version of what she did that was cleaner than the reality. The publications liked the origin story, the Sawmill arrangement, the grandfather's workshop mythology. They did not tend to dwell on the Burlington Community Board review, the winter drives in the dark, the slab that had split down the center on the third day, and taught her everything she'd subsequently built on. She gave interviews when asked, answered questions, accurately corrected the mythology when it drifted too far from the actual record. The journalist generally found this less interesting than the mythology. She found it more important. The Stowe Hotel Commission came together in the early months of the fifth year. 12 rooms, 48 chairs, 12 tables, a project that had required 6 months of planning before a single slab was cut. Clara had worked through the specifications with the hotel's design director over 3 separate visits, selecting slabs from the inventory log matching figure patterns across pieces that would share the same rooms, ensuring the mineral streaks that one designer might have considered flaws. Read instead as the specific signature of a material that had grown in a particular place under particular conditions. Nothing in the Stowe Commission came from a catalog. Everything in it came from a field in Iowa where a sawmill had been depositing its discards every Tuesday for 5 years. The commission completed in March. Cole drove the first load, Roy the second, Clara the third, each delivery met by the hotel's design director. Each piece placed according to a floor plan they'd developed together, the installation documented with photographs that would appear in the hotel's marketing materials the following season. The figured maple surfaces did in those rooms what they'd done in Burlington cafe windows and Vermont cabin dining rooms. They held morning light with a warmth that guests would later try to describe, and mostly failed to settling for photographs of rooms they'd slept in that captured something they couldn't quite name but knew they wanted to return to. The backlog after Stowe extended to 14 weeks. Clara did not apologize for this. The inquiry form on the website she'd finally built a spare direct thing, no lifestyle photography, no origin mythology, stated the current lead time plainly at the top of the page above the contact information before the portfolio. People who couldn't wait didn't inquire. People who inquired understood what the wait meant. Raymond Polk called on a Monday morning in October of the 5th year. Clara was in the barn with Cole when her phone showed Hargrove Mill's number. She picked up expecting a delivery schedule question. Occasionally, Raymond called to flag an unusually large batch coming or to confirm the Tuesday timing around a holiday. She stepped to the barn doors while Cole continued working on the chair frames for a new commission, another hotel property, this one in the Berkshires. Raymond's voice had a different quality than the operational calls, measured, more careful. He asked how the business was going. She told him. He said he'd read the Shelter magazine piece. She acknowledged it. There was a pause of the kind that precedes the actual reason for a call. The ownership group at Hargrove has been talking, Raymond said, about the material we've been bringing you, about what you've built with it. Another pause. They've asked me to have a conversation with you about whether you'd consider a purchase offer for the business, the brand, the client relationships, the inventory system. They'd want to keep the name. Clara looked out the barn doors at the maple pile. 5 years of Tuesday deliveries, the oldest slabs at the bottom, long since worked into furniture, sitting in Vermont cabins, Maine coastal houses, a Chicago apartment, a farmhouse in Burlington, with pine floors from 1887. The newest slabs at the top, still pale, still months from workable, still engaged in their own internal process that didn't consult anyone's acquisition timeline. She understood what Hargrove was proposing. They had spent 5 years watching what she'd built from their waste stream and had arrived at the conclusion that the gap between what they'd been calling zero value and what the market had been confirming was actual value was a gap they should control. It was a logical business position. Raymond was a logical man. The offer was, she was certain, a serious one. What did they have in mind? Not commitment information. She listened to the figure, which was significant, which confirmed that they'd done genuine research into what the client list, the backlog, the brand recognition actually represented in market terms. She thanked Raymond. She told him she'd need time to think. She put the phone in her pocket. She walked to the workbench where the moisture log for the current slab selection sat open. She read the number she'd entered 3 days ago for the Berkshire's commission pieces, all within working range, all confirming what she'd known when she selected them, all representing the culmination of a reading process that had started the moment each piece came off the Hargrove truck, and she'd crouched down to press the meter pins into the end grain. She thought about what Hargrove's ownership would do with the client relationships, the designers who called because they trusted her judgment about the material, the architects who specified Weston and Earl because they knew what they were getting. She thought about what industrial ownership did to the tolerance for approximation, the patience for lead times that reflected what the work required rather than what a quarterly report preferred. She thought about Cole at the bench behind her and Roy at the finishing station, and their particular quality of understanding a material the way you understand something you've touched long enough to stop thinking about consciously. She thought about Earl Weston in a New Hampshire workshop, running his hand across a warped tabletop. Someone had decided was finished telling an 11-year-old girl that the people who learned to pay attention to what others had stopped looking at never ran out of material. He had not been describing a business strategy. He had been describing a relationship with the world, a way of moving through it that generated its own continuity, that didn't require external validation to sustain itself, because the material kept coming and the attention kept finding it, and the gap between what others dismissed as worthless and what careful work could produce was not a market inefficiency to be captured by the right owner. It was a way of life that happened to generate income, and the two things were not separable in the way an acquisition would require them to be. She called Raymond back that afternoon. "Tell the ownership group I appreciate the offer. I'm not selling." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask why?" Clara looked at the barn interior Cole, at the bench the overhead lights she'd strung 4 years ago still in place alongside the better ones added last winter. The wide-belt sander Roy had learned to operate with the precision of a hand tool, the chair frames for the Berkshire's commission lined along the south wall. The spiral notebook on its hook above the bench, its pages long exhausted, replaced by a second notebook and then a third, the system it represented now living in a documented database on her laptop. But the notebooks kept anyway because they were the record of how the knowledge had actually been built, not arrived at, not transferred, but constructed, mistake by mistake, season by season, slab by slab. Because they'd run it correctly, she told Raymond. They'd make it efficient. They'd optimize the lead times and standardize the finishes and replace the inventory system with something scalable. A pause. The thing that makes it worth buying is exactly the thing that can't survive being bought. Raymond considered this. That's either very wise or very stubborn. Clara looked at the 14 miles of distance between where she was standing and the Hargrove Mill processing floor, where every day the material that didn't fit the commercial definition of value came off the line and went into a pile destined for her Tuesday delivery. She thought about 5 years of those deliveries, the involuntary education they'd funded, the inventory they'd built without knowing they were building anything. Probably both, she said. The following Tuesday, the Hargrove truck came down the gravel path the way it always had. Without announcement, without ceremony, the engine dropping a gear at Route 9, the way it had done 263 times before. Clara heard it from the kitchen. She came out with her coffee. The air had the specific quality of October in Iowa, the tree line at the back of the property burning in the colors her great-uncle Harlan had apparently found, compelling enough to spend 40 years watching. Deep amber into rust, into the last holdout green of leaves that hadn't gotten the message yet. The driver lowered the bed. The maple came down. He leveled the platform and drove back up the path without getting out the way he always had, the whole operation taking less than 4 minutes the way it always had. Clara walked across the field to the new pile. The slab on top was wide 30 inches, at least the bark edge running in a long arc along one side. The grain straight near the center, then rippling outward in a pattern she recognized immediately as flame figure. Dense compressed waves formed only in maple that had grown under particular stress. Wind-load competition for light, the specific pressure of difficult conditions producing over decades, something that no sheltered growth could have generated. She crouched. She pressed the meter pins into the end grain. Read the number. High, months out, maybe more. She noted it in the log. She stayed crouched for a moment, her palm flat against the surface, not measuring, just reading the way her grandfather had read a warped tabletop on a bench in New Hampshire, while she stood in a doorway asking the wrong question. The grain moved under her hand in the way of figured wood, the surface changing texture as the wave of the figure ran against and then with the plane of her palm. The tree that had produced this piece had spent decades under conditions that most trees don't survive intact. The stress had not weakened it. The stress had made the figure. George Albright was at the fence. He had a thermos instead of a mug, the October air requiring the insulation. The wool hat he'd switched to in the third year was pulled down against a wind coming across the field from the northwest. He'd been watching these Tuesday deliveries for 5 years from various positions on his side of the property line, and his fundamental nature hadn't changed. He was still a man who drew conclusions carefully and held them with the confidence earned from 30 years of measuring things that didn't move until you understood why. He stood at the fence without speaking for a long moment. Clara rose from her crouch, brushed the end-grain dust from her palm, and looked at him across the field. "I had no idea," George said. The words carried the weight of a man who had verified something enough times to be certain of it, not an apology because George Albright was not structured for apology, but a recalibration delivered plainly, which from him was worth considerably more than elaborate acknowledgement from someone less careful with language. Clara walked to the fence. She poured coffee from her mug into the thermos cup he extended without being asked. He accepted it the same way the transaction complete in the gesture no words required on either side. "Neither did I," she said. Not at first. They stood at the fence with their coffee looking at the barn. Through the open doors, Cole was visible at the bench, running a hand plane along a slab edge with the deliberate stroke he'd developed over a year of working beside her. Not her stroke exactly his own, adapted from the same understanding of grain direction, but expressed through hands that had spent decades learning how older materials behaved under pressure. The sound of the plane carrying across the October field was the sound of something continuing the way things continue when they found the shape they were always moving toward. George drank his coffee. Clara drank hers. After a while, he walked back to his porch. She walked back to the barn. The new slab was in the log with its number and its date. In 3 months, or 6 or 8, whenever the number said it was ready, she would select it for a commission, set it on the bench run, the plane across its surface, and it would begin whatever it was going to become next. The flame figure running through its grain had taken decades of difficult growth to produce. It had been waiting the way everything that requires time waits, without impatience, without the ability to hurry in the complete patience of things that have no choice but to be what they are until the right attention finds them. She picked up the paring chisel, waiting on the bench where she'd left it the evening before. The mortise for the side table commission was cut. The tenon was fitted. She needed to take one more thin slice from the shoulder. She could feel the fit was almost there, but not yet fully there the way you feel a conclusion arriving before it fully arrives. She set the bevel against the wood. One careful stroke. She lifted the piece, fitted the joint, pressed it closed with her hands. Right, fully finally right. She held it for a moment, 2 pieces of figured maple joined at a tolerance that required no force to close and would hold under decades of use without the adhesive doing anything more than confirming what the geometry had already made true. Then she set it down, reached for the glue, and went back to work.